All right, well, Susan got most everything right about me. I got a master's in reproductive physiology at Connecticut, so I worked in all animals, but mostly in dairy heifers. I've been the county agent here in Washington County since 1996 and been in extension since 1988. Was a sheep breeder at one time, and we'll talk about that a little bit further as we get through the presentation. I will tell you this. I apologize to you folks out there with goats because most of my examples are going to come from the world of sheep or cattle. But anyway, and my dairy background will shine through just a little bit. Okay, well, breeding systems is our topic for this evening, and it's basically the segment of animal agriculture where it addresses the evaluation and the genetic value of domestic livestock and how we're going to pass that on to the young stock. And breed is a group of animals with homogeneous appearance and behavior and other characteristics that distinguish it from other animals of the same species. Obviously, you don't need to distinguish them from other animals of other species. Breeding systems, we're going to talk about everything on the slide there. We'll mention single trait selection and balanced trait selection, but really that'll go in the selection topic, which will follow, I think, next week, actually. Well, sheep and goats were domesticated about 10,000 years ago. Actually, it made it possible for civilization to spread because if you think about it, they were always walking with their lunch, whether it be they were milking the animals or eating them. But at the same time, because the animals were mobile and the people were mobile, we basically were able to move civilization out of what was known as the Fertile Crescent or that area of the Middle East and moved it across to the rest of what we know now as the world. Shepherding is well established in the biblical record and in a lot of other historical records. There's many references to sheep and goats in the Bible, and I'll let you do that reading for yourself. Breeds really weren't established as we know them today until the late 1800s. The picture of the sheep down in the corner, for those of you that don't know, is a Jacob. There's a lot of arguing about where that breed got its name. I'm not going to weigh in on that, but most people will say that it came from the biblical spotted sheep that Jacob bred. If you know the story, Jacob was not the most honest man in the world, and neither was his uncle Laban. Jacob says, you get the solid colored sheep, Uncle Laban, I get the spotted sheep. And anyway, Jacob got the best of the deal because he knew how to select for spotted sheep. Selection really was unused primarily because most of the time these shepherds were Bedouins. They couldn't seclude their rams or bucks. They ran with the herd. Many times, I'm not tapping anything. Maybe I shouldn't move my head. I can hear a little bit of that. My microphone may be moving. I'll try not to do that. So anyway, these shepherds weren't really using selection as we know it today because the males were running with the females all the time. And so there wasn't a whole lot of selection being done as we know it. We're going to talk about breeds, and basically landrace is the local variety domesticated animals, and that's really what was going on prior to formal selection by man. And these breeds would basically develop in local geographic areas. Sometimes a male would be brought in from a neighboring community, but you have to remember prior to really a lot of the transportation avenues that we have today, there wasn't a lot of moving of livestock on a regular basis. The Romans certainly, in Europe anyway, made it much easier with their road system, but not like we have it today. You didn't throw a buck in the back of the pickup truck and drive it to Indiana. So that's really the big difference there. There's a whole lot more variation in landrace breeds. By the way, I forgot to tell you the picture there. They're Hebridean sheep from one of the isles off Scotland, and that's a Shetland there. That's also off the Scottish Isles. Of course, they're being selected today because they're off those islands and they're actually in other parts of the world being selected. I stand corrected, by the way, those are Gulf Coast natives, not Hebrideans. But the landrace usually were more genetically and physically diverse than what we have as formal breeds because no one was doing selection like man does today. Robert Bakewell is often thought of as basically the modern, who started modern breeding. Again, he lived in the 1700s, and he was the guy that started selection. He bred what became to be known Bakewell Leicesters, Dishley Leicesters. He took Lincolnshire type sheep and started selecting them. His farm was named Dishley, so it got the name Dishley Leicesters. Leicestershire, England is where he was from. And he used the selection method of like begets like. So if you breed your best ewe to your best ram, you should get an even better offspring. Or he also applied those same selection pressures to cattle and to horses. He did such a good job of refining these sheep that the reason today that Colonial Williamsburg raises Leicester long wool sheep is because Dishley Leicester rams show up in the papers of both Thomas Jefferson and George Washington. So what's a breed? Basically, it's a specific group domesticated with looking for a homogeneous appearance, behavior, and other characteristics to distinguish it from other animals of the same species. And it's arrived at through selective breeding. Everyone knows how, at least especially in the dairy business here in the United States, that most dairy cows are black and white, and that certainly is the hallmark color of Holsteins. All they do come in red and white, but primarily that breed was developed for high milk production, large size, and certainly the black and white hide is very, very distinctive. Despite the centrality idea of breeds, there is no scientifically accepted definition of the term. So every breed organization has its own, what we call breed standard. It's certainly the members decide what that breed should look like, and sometimes it does change over time. I use the Holstein already as an example. Up until the mid-70s, you could not register a red and white Holstein in the Holstein herd book. They didn't understand that the red and black recessive dominant genes, and typically it was embarrassing to have a red calf if you were a Holstein breeder. Basic line was that the neighbor's Guernsey bull jumped the fence, which wasn't the case at all. But and when it comes to beef cattle, we're the only nation in the world that separates our Angus into two herd books, reds and blacks. Again, at some point in time, people didn't understand the red-black gene, and so that's basically how breeds work. In sheep breed, it's the same way. In sheep breeds, I should say, those of you that raise what's known as the down breeds, you notice how the wool has disappeared from Hampshires and from Shropshires, and they used to have much more wool on their face and on their legs than they do today. It's not that the breed has necessarily changed, but some of the breed standard has changed, and some of even the genetics inside those breeds have changed. One of the oldest sheep breeds is the Caracal, and that dates back to 1400 years before Christ. There was some paintings found in Babylonian temples, and so the Caracal, rightly or wrongly, gets the nod for the oldest sheep breed. Caracal gets its name from a spot there in Turkistan, and you can see that that's in certainly Western Asia there, bordered by Kazakhstan and Mongolia. Domestic goats, again, what's the oldest breed and why do we even care? I guess it's bragging rights. Certainly, goats were domesticated along with sheep thousands of years ago. They were much better milk producers, so they certainly got the nod there. Again, if you remember the Bible story, when Jacob stole Esau's birthright, he put the hide of the goat's skin on his arms to fool his dad. So Isaac was blind, by the way. It wasn't that he couldn't tell the difference. Nubians gets a nod again. Comes from Nubia, northern Sudan, desert region, and as we know, that's the long floppy ears, and again for dissipation of heat and so on. So certainly it is a very popular breed in lots of places, and they were anglicized. So those of you that are dairy goat breeders out there, it certainly was. It's Anglo-Nubian. The stock originally that came from Nubia probably didn't look like anything in the picture, but certainly Nubians are very popular across the world. And if you look at the Oklahoma State Breeds website, they'll make mention of the fact that Nubians were anglicized, and certainly not surprising, as the English at one time had many colonies in Africa. So what's the purpose of breeding systems? One of my favorite terms is what you don't measure, you can't manage. So if you're just running ewes or does and whatever happens to have testicles breeds them, it is a form of management, but it's not a great form of management. We use breeding systems to select for desirable traits and to select against negative traits. We should have goals or targets. What are we looking for? What are we trying to accomplish? And again, Susan will get into that with selection, but certainly proven that single trait selection works in the dairy business, because certainly we have really produced a dairy cow that can produce a lot of milk. They certainly at the expense of some other traits, but nonetheless. We have purebreds. Those are the guys inside a breed that meet a standard. You're mating males and females from the same breed, and your resultant offspring are what we would consider purebred. Purebred flock can be managed as a single unit because all the animals are the same breed, and you can certainly make selections inside there. So if you wanted to, when we get to inbreeding and line breeding and outcrossing, you can certainly work multiple flocks even though you have a purebred flock. The goal of the purebred industry really is to provide superior genetics to the commercial industry. You can't do a crossbreeding program without good purebreds. Inbreeding and outbreeding, there's various mating schemes of animals, and they're classified into two broad categories. The classification depends on the closeness of the biological relationship between the mates, and within each category there's a wide variation of intensity of the relationship that exists. There's a very fine line that separates these two categories. Some folks will argue about what indeed is inbreeding with less closely related relatives such as first and second cousins. People disagree about this. One thing you have to remember when you're breeding livestock, you can't put it in the same context as we do in the human world. It's often been taboo with close relationships in humans, but not necessarily the case when it comes to livestock. And then mating between less closely related animals is what constitutes outbreeding, and crossbreeding is a form of outbreeding. Inbreeding, sometimes it's called line breeding, is mating closely related animals, parent to offspring, full brother to full sister, and so on and so forth. Technically, it's defined as mating animals more closely related than the average relationship in the breeder population. And so that really, if you use that definition, it can really be a much different relationship, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. Some of the value of inbreeding is the lines can intensify positive traits. The problem is it also can intensify negative traits, and there is some reduction in performance. This reduction manifests itself in many ways. The obvious effect is poor reproductive efficiency. That's usually one of the first. Higher mortality rates, slower growth rates, and the higher frequency of abnormalities. Here's some of the inbreeding. A full brother to full sister is 25%. I'm not sure what that question is. At what inbreeding coefficient do you gen? Do you generally see problems crop up? Typically, it's going to be in that 25% or higher range. It will also depend on it'll also depend on the any negative genes that it'll express. That negative genes will express themselves. 25% of what is the relationship. That's what it means. And by the way, it assumes that these are not related prior to that. In other words, the full brother and full sister are outcrosses beyond the mother. In other words, the mother and father are not related, is what I'm saying there. Or in the case of the father-daughter, again, the father is related to the daughter, but not to the daughter's mother, if you get my drift. So that's what that means, and that's why those percentages are what they are. That's the percentage of shared okay, the typed in questions are going too fast for me to read and answer, so I'll get back to those if I can. There's lots of the breed associations, especially in cattle, will allow you to select against inbreeding as well. Here's some inbreeding depression. In other words, what happens if there's a 5% depression in milk production, a 3% depression in growth, a 4% in offspring born, and a 10% in offspring weaned. So that's, again, that will also change depending on the severity of these depressions. Will depend on how related they are. Some very famous inbred or line bred is Y. Angus. The University of Maryland owns that herd now. All the Angus on that farm trace back to 8 females that were imported in the 50s from Scotland. Again, very careful selection of breeding, and that's on the bottom side, by the way. There are more bulls added that came from Scotland as well, but that takes a lot of homework to keep them from getting too related. Genetic abnormalities are one of the reasons why we really shy away from inbreeding or line breeding, because of dwarfism in sheep and cattle. There's a congenital cardiac defect in pygmy goats. Umbilical hernias are very highly heritable in swine, and a condition called tying up in horses, which leads me to an example of when you are using a breeding system, you need to have some goals and in my humble opinion, some goals that really mean something. I had this, I'm not a horse person. I should get that disclaimer right out there now so all you horse folks can be insulted in just a few seconds. But I never heard of tying up before, and I was asking a person about it because I was speaking on pasture management at a horse conference, and the person said, told me what it was, and I said, is it genetic? And she said, yeah, and I said, can you select against it? And she said, yes, you can. And I said, so why don't you? Why would you use a stallion that you knew passed on tying up? And her answer to me was very blunt and very simple. Because he sires pretty babies. And pretty babies in the horse industry may be okay because they really have no economic value from a performance standpoint on a meat animal side. All you folks that are horse lovers, calm down. But to me, it was just that simple. You just don't use a stallion that passes the gene on, and you can probably get rid of it pretty quickly. But because it's yes, and the quarter horse industry does have it, as well as draft horses. So it's the big muscled breeds. Outcrossing is, again, keeping the family separate, if you will, mating an individual to another individual, but they're not related. And it's the most widely used mating system by commercial and seed stock producers because you can, within a breed, you can get that word right there, heterozygosity, or if you want to think of it, heterosis within a breed if you select in that manner. Elevation, round oak round gap elevation is a perfect example of this in the dairy industry. And one of the reasons why cattle and especially the dairy industry are easier to use examples of is because of the fact that artificial insemination has been going on in the dairy industry since the 50s. And so the number of sires available has greatly decreased with the advent of artificial insemination. So obviously, Elevation had 10,000 registered sons and 60,000 registered daughters and over 300,000 offspring, meaning the rest of those animals were not registered, but were what the dairy industry would call grades. Elevation is, it's 6.25. I'm sorry. The inbreeding coefficient in the Holstein breed is relatively in that ballpark of 6.25. The Elevation was an interesting individual because Elevation was an outcross, but his dam and sire were inbred. His sire was actually the result of a father-daughter mating, and his mother went back to the same bull 14 times if you went back in her pedigree long enough or far enough. So basically what happened is you had two intensely line-bred lines. Once they were bred to each other, that resultant outcross probably had the biggest impact on a breed of livestock in all the world. And that was primarily because the genes just lined up right. Elevation was known to make great daughters and some great sons, but primarily his sons were average at best. Now we'll get into crossbreeding, which is something that question is semen still being used? There is some semen still out there, but it's not widely used. There are some old purists that will every now and then breed a cow to him, I think just for fun. ABS actually doesn't have Elevation semen, but they have semen from a bull they collected in 1950, and they will every year try to get a pregnancy to see how long frozen semen is viable. To my knowledge, At this point in time, they have never failed to get a pregnancy. So that semen is still viable from 1950 to today. And yes, Elevation's been dead since the mid 80s. So here we are with crossbreeding. Again, this is very common practice especially in meat production, and it's certainly prominent in sheep, goat, and beef cattle. And we like to look at breeding more. Crossbreeding is the use of more than one breed. The advantage is you take advantage of different and complementary strong points of the different breeds you use. However, unfortunately, in the sheep industry and also in a lot of industries, including the beef industry, it's rather haphazard. There's no plan, and some of that is because of the size of their herds or flocks. If you've got a small flock, it's difficult. Or if you've got 10 goats out there, it's difficult to have a very precise breeding program. And the same with the other breeds. But crossbreeding really should be, if you want to take the greatest advantage of it, there needs to be a plan. There needs to be a system, not just, well, I like that buck, I'm going to buy him and throw him in with the does and see what comes out. The crossbreeding is easy to implement and maintain, but use the KISS method. Keep your approaches simple. There's no need to get an elaborate system. And again, if you have one breed, know what the complementary traits of the other breed are that you're trying to get to match your goals. So use those strong points of the breeds. The well-defined system will really allow that to happen. Again, if you're trying to improve the efficiency of meat production, wool production, or milk production, it certainly can happen over pure breeding. Now, the dairy folks will take exception to that because they've been selecting for milk production, single trait selection. So there's no question that we can't produce as much milk with crossbreds as they can with purebreds, but we can produce probably more pounds of milk over a lifetime because we have an animal that lasts longer. Again, in the dairy cattle business, the average life expectancy for a dairy cow in the United States is 2.5 lactations. That's 4.5 years old. And so, again, if we get a crossbred, she might not produce as much as that purebred Holstein, but she probably will milk, 4, 5, or 6 lactations. So over time, she may indeed produce more milk and certainly will pay for herself. Crossbreeding optimizes the amount of hybrid vigor and it produces a uniform product. Here's a ewe and some crossbred lambs. Actually, they're Susans. Another advantage in crossbreeding lies in the ability to utilize the breed complement. Again, using breeds that complement one another. And they certainly do a good job. Jerseys are somewhat long-lived, but Jerseys are becoming intensely inbred, and that's just a question I saw out of the corner of my eye there. All breeds have their strengths and weaknesses. Contrary to popular belief, no one breed excels in everything. It is certainly not, individual-wise, again, we have to look at population genetics whenever we talk about genetics, whenever we talk about breeding, whenever we talk about selection, because someone can always come up with a genetic outlier that this animal, breeds back every time, she milks well, she always has twins, blah, blah, blah. But the question really is will she pass those traits along? And there's been a number of superior females, again, going back to my dairy background, that were great cows but never had a daughter worth, sticking a milker under. So again, you have to look at the fact that we're talking about populations and not individuals. Production can be optimized when mating systems place breeds in roles that maximize their strength and minimize their weaknesses. You think about in sheep breeding, we know that we have the meat breeds like a Texel or a Suffolk, but we never want to utilize them thinking we're going to add maternal traits to the cross. We're not. We're adding growth traits to the cross. Here's just a table with some heterosis figures, the percent of heterosis from crossbred lambs. Lisa and Bill, I'm not a fleece guy, so I'm going to have to let Susan handle that one. I know that crossbreeding, has effect on wool, but most of the time, a lot of times when we're crossing, we're doing it for growth aspects. As far as heterosis, what is it? It's basically, it's an additive effect. What happens is we can't point to a specific, what it amounts to is the sum is greater than its parts. If you understand what I mean, that's what heterosis is. The sum is greater than its parts. So it's really one of those 1 + 1 = 3 deals. And because of that outcrossing, or that you get that explosion in, and of course explosion is relative, but you can see the traits here. What I thought was interesting was the carcass traits. There's 0 effect from heterosis in the lamb, but you can see all the other traits. And when it gets down to lambs reared and weight of lambs weaned, that's a significant advantage from heterosis. You can see that here's again, these are Susans. Lambs, you can see they both lean or list a little bit. Well, the C's must be rough in that picture, but you can see the difference in the white lamb and the Suffolk cross lamb. Again, I'm assuming that these are of similar age, since this is Susan's picture, but you can see the difference. Now, that doesn't mean the white lamb would make a good mother. It just means that we've gotten the growth. I know for a fact that the Suffolk lamb mom is a Katahdin, so we have the Katahdin maternal genetics on the bottom side and the growth genetics on the top side, and you wouldn't expect to get high growth genetics out of a purebred Katahdin. So that's what you're seeing there a lot. Here's again, you can look at this. You'll be able to get this PowerPoint off of SlideShare tomorrow, and you'll also be able to listen to the recording again if you like. But this stuff here, just again, the heterosis and the crossbred ewe. If we have a cross ewe that now we're going to put another animal across, or another breed across, these are some of the things we can expect to get from her. Crossbreeding, it can be, again, it can be a true two-breed cross, it can be a rotational breed cross, and then we have what's called a terminal cross. A two-breed cross is just simply you breed, for instance, if we want to use goats as an example, we take a boar buck, we put it over Kiko does, and then we just rotate the cross. So that F1 boar Kiko cross, we would now breed to a Kiko buck, and then the resulting offspring we breed back to a boar buck, and so on. That certainly makes the crossing simple. I had a person tell me one time that they went to New Zealand. In New Zealand, they use what they call Friesians, what we would call Holsteins, and Jerseys are the two predominant breeds. And he asked the inseminator, he says, "What's your system here?" And he says, "Well, if she's black, I breed her brown, and if she's brown, I breed her black." So again, not very sophisticated two-breed rotation. We can get into what the dairy business calls pro-cross, which is basically we would take that, we would introduce a third, maybe fourth breed. So if we had a Kiko and a boar cross, we might breed that resulting F1 to a Savannah, or maybe we took the boar on a Nubian and we took that resulting cross, and we would take that F1 and breed it to, probably I would breed, if I was going to go that way, I'd go the Kiko Nubian and then put the boar on it, but whatever works for you works for me. The terminal cross is basically we don't keep any offspring. This is a very common practice in the United Kingdom. This is a two-breed cross. These ewes are called mules. They're a hill breed. usually maybe Scottish Blackface crossed with a Border Leicester, or it's Cheviot, and you get those broken-faced lambs, clean-legged, not a lot of belly wool, so it makes it easy to lamb them. And so these crossbred ewes, then we put a terminal cross over top, which which we'll see later in the slideshow. But basically, they'll use a big, heavy-muscled ram like a Charolais or a Texel. And again, this is the system in Scotland, in England, and they produce a very consistent carcass. I've seen them, and hard to believe, but in the U.S., lamb is thought of as being very expensive and not something that the average Joe eats. In Scotland, it's exactly different. The average Joe is more likely to eat lamb and less likely to eat pork because, again, cereal grains, which are very much in the diet of pork or swine, they don't grow a lot of in the UK. And so we have the corn, or maize as the Brits would call it, and we can produce pork, and pork is much more readily available. Rotational cross, again, 3 or more breeds. Again, I caution against being too complex, because how are you going to remember and where are you going to keep the bucks when you're not using them and all those other kind of things. It can be done. You just need to make sure that you have a plan and you and your rams are willing to stick to it, or you and your bucks, because sometimes you have to remember, for a ram or a buck, sex does not work. So they are more than happy to find their way through the fence or over a gate or whatever, and your composite breed may look a little different, or I mean your crossbred. With intensive selection and back crossing, you can come up with what we call a composite breed. To the right of your screen is a Katahdin, which is a composite hair sheep. They bred a bunch of different breeds together, started selecting, back crossing, and so on, came up with a breed they call Katahdin, named after Mount Katahdin. It's for those of you in Maine. And the other on the left-hand side of the screen are Polypays. Again, they're a composite breed. Another one is Targhee. There's lots of different breeds. Will they breed true? The answer to that question is yes, because of the intense back crossing and all those things. It takes a long time. It takes many generations, and so it's difficult to get a true composite breed in a short amount of time. And when I mean back crossing, I mean we would take a Boer buck and a Kiko doe, and we would cross that, and then we'd take a Kiko buck and a Boer doe, and we cross that, and then we could cross those resulting F1s together, and then we might, again, in the Brangus breed, for instance, in cattle, sorry about the cattle reference, but it's basically, if you got right down to it, it's 3/8 Brahma and 5/8 Angus, but it's not that simple, because we've taken those Angus Brangus or Angus Brahma crosses and back cross them to Angus and back cross them to Brahma, and then cross the resulting crosses, and so it's a very complex, and it's not for the faint of heart. You have to have meticulous records and identification systems, and so you really need to do a lot of homework. Susan makes a good point. All breeds start out as crossbreds. Dishley Leicesters, Robert Bakewell, his Leicesters were just common sheep that he applied selection pressure to, and certainly kept. There's actually a white Suffolk in Australia, so those things are done all the time. Here's the terminal cross that I talked about before. There's a mule ewe, and she's got 2 Texel sired lambs in front of her. Those lambs wouldn't be kept for breeding. They would make their way to someone's dinner table, and they are beautiful lambs. I don't really care for Texel, full-blood Texels, but a Texel F1 really makes a nice sheep. And they really are well muscled, and that that Mule ewe right there, she must be a pretty good milker because she's got some beautiful lambs standing in front of her. And again, mule is just a just a term for a crossbred ewe that's going to be used again, that's intensifying the maternal traits, and then we're going to put a big muscled animal on her. There's no magic in what that breed mixture is. I certainly, if I ever got back into sheep breeding, I've thought about trying to make mules with Katahdins if I could get a good shedder anyway. I'm not into shearing. I used to raise long wools, Leicester long wools to be exact, so you might understand why I'm not into shearing. So just to review a little bit, many crossbreeding systems are difficult to accomplish in a small flock, which may only have the option for 1 or 2 breeding groups. Again, if you've got a small flock, you may want to go to purchasing replacement females that are already crosses for you, so you could find someone to make you some mules, if you will. You could alternate your lamb and ewe breeds. In other words, use a Katahdin ram one time and a Suffolk ram the next time, and know that you're going to give up again some of the traits that you're looking for. Another option, of course, is to find a breeder. You probably won't get their absolute positive best buck or best ram, but buy a yearling ram, use him for a season, put him in the freezer. And that way you can kind of keep your genetic base where you might need it. Again, are you going to buy someone's top ram lamb that way or top buck? Probably not. But will it suit your needs? Perhaps. Is there anyone out there that's got any questions? I'll be happy to answer what I can. I can watch the chat box now because I don't have to look so hard at my slides and make sure that I'm saying what I need to say.